Hey, this is Keith Ellison for another edition of Affording Your Life. As you know, I'm the Attorney General for the state of Minnesota, and I'm the people's lawyer. This week, I want to talk to you about a really special trip that I was so honored to do earlier in March. And it was a trip to Selma, Alabama, when over 100 Minnesotans, some of them went in cars, some of them went in planes, some of them went on buses, but we all went down to this sacred space in Selma, Alabama. And one of the leaders of the trip was the amazing Manta Chum, who has been a great leader in the area of immigration rights in Minnesota and an inspiration around the country. Manta, thank you for joining me today. And when the opportunity for you to go down to Alabama came up, why did you think it was important for you and your Minnesota 8 team to join the other Minnesotans who went?
Well, Keith, I just want to start off by saying thank you again for the invitation, first of all, for us to be able to come down. I think a lot of people know me and know how I got into organizing, right? So I just want to share a little bit about that is that, like, I came into organizing through my family's lived experience. I'm a Southeast Asian Cambodian refugee, and my community didn't really come to the US because of privilege, right? Oftentimes it's overlooked. People think that we came here because of privilege, but it was really because of war, because of displacement, because of the US being involved in secretly bombing our countries. And that history is often invisible, but it's the reason why we're here is because America was there. And for me, it became very personal when my brother faced deportation. I also want to share with folks that, like, you were our key champion. Like, a lot of folks don't really know that during your time as a member of Congress and our this crisis kind of came about for us in 2016. We knocked on so many people's doors, and um, I share this because I think it's important as constituents, and then we reach out to elected officials like yourself, and oftentimes we're speaking with their staffers. But you were the only person, the only elected official that we got to meet face to face, and yeah, you were there fighting for us even then as a member of Congress. And so I want to say thank you. And for my brother broke a window, which was he committed this minor offense, but because of the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 96, also known as IRA, he was suddenly now facing deportation to a country he never stepped foot in. And so because of that, the moment changed for me, and it made me realize how policies can really tear families apart and how immigrant communities are still fighting for basic dignity and fairness. And so when you gave us this invitation for us to come down to Selma, it was a no-brainer to say, you know what, I'm going to go to Selma this year. I've heard about Bloody Sunday. And as a believer in Jesus Christ, also is something that I'm unashamed about. And I share often. Being in a place like Selma really helped to solidify the movement work and my faith, right, together. And being there, a huge part of what really felt like this journey meant so much more than just like organizing work or just being out there protesting or whatever, was that you talked about how we got down there. Well, for me, it was so deeply connected. Um, I brought my son, who's 16 years old now, and my husband, and it became a true pilgrimage across generations. And we traveled from Minneapolis on a bus with my team and with so many others. We started here, went to Chicago. We went and honored the Reverend Jesse Jackson. He, just passed not too long before that. And then we went on to Selma to commemorate Bloody Sunday. And while we were there, I kept thinking about how 1965, and thank you to you also being in Brown Church and hearing you connect the two, because oftentimes our people, like my people, Asian folks, don't realize how our liberations are really tied together and how so much pain came before even our own genocide, right? With how the Black folks, really paved the way for our people. And so I kept thinking about how the 1965 Voting Rights Act also really gave, like, it wasn't just about that, it also gave us the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. So the Immigrant Rights Bill came just a few months after. And so that law made things possible for families like mine.
Well, let me just jump in here because uh, you here's the thing: the Black civil rights struggle. people who know that it was inspired by the liberation of India, which is in Asia, and you know, Dr. Martin Luther King visited India, learned about nonviolence, studied the work of Gandhi. So it's not like this movement's here and that movement's there and they don't overlap. They certainly do overlap. And let's also remember, yeah, we had Jim Crow, but we also this country has a lot of history of anti-Asian hate. The Chinese Exclusion Act, people didn't they didn't care much whether you were actually Chinese or not, but if you had the look of East Asia, that was enough for the bigots, right? People don't know. I mean, Japanese internment, we know about that. Concentration camps for Japanese American citizens because the United States was in a war with Japan. Of course, we didn't do that against Nazi Germany, did we? We were in a war with them too, you know, but they didn't intern German Americans. At the end of the day, and then let's not forget about Vincent Chin, a man who was an auto worker in Detroit. Some thugs blamed him for the loss of auto jobs in Detroit, chased him because they were going to beat him and assault him. He ran into traffic and he got killed. There is this phenomena in the United States called as yellow peril, and it is a form of anti-Asian racism and hate that we don't talk about enough, because a lot of the what you will find is that the people who want to divide us want to say, well, the Asians are the nice immigrants or the nice brown people, the nice people of color, and you black people are in trouble all the time, and we don't, you know, and the real truth is that is that this is just another way to sort of otherize a group of Americans. So what the thing that impressed me about you, Manta, is that you saw past the division. You saw Selma as your own, you saw it as part of who you were as a woman, as a freedom fighter, as a civil rights leader. And you got on that bus and not only did that, you brought your family, you brought your husband, who's a super nice guy, and you brought your team. So thank you. I should have started out with your background, but now let's just jump into, hey, you had a choice whether to get on that bus or not, and you chose to do it. How come?
I think it's just really important to be a part of what I watched and saw. And I don't know, I still, to be honest with you, I'm still processing it. I'm still processing a lot of it. It was a lot to take in. Yeah, so I have I struggle with still like I have all of this pain and anger, right? But then there's also so much joy that comes from it. And I chose to go because, again, I just think about like everything that you mentioned. um Immigrant rights didn't come after civil rights, like you said. It really is a part of it. It came from it. It's the same movement that secured voting rights, also opened the doors for our families. That's why this work isn't separate, it's connected. And I think connecting the two and being down there, as I remember going back through some of the pictures, and I'm like, wow, there were only probably like 10 or 15 of us that represented the API community that showed up. And in a way, it makes me really sad. But it also opened up the idea and the opportunity for me to say in the future, this is what I want to make sure that our communities really see and show up and also go and be a part of. You talked about, again, you said like my husband, right? Like, I think when I started this work and got into this work 10 years ago, it was because of crisis. My son, who at the time was only 6 years old, didn't know anything, but he was out there just because he was a 6 year old and wanted to just be out there with his family, didn't know the harms that could have come in it. I remember my 10-year old at the time, who's now 20, and being told to go back to a country that she never set foot in, or like she never even been anywhere. She was born here. And but now my 16-year-old got to be a part of this, and it was this journey that I'm like, wow, this is going to be so meaningful to him. And he got to be in Brown Church listening to you, the Attorney General of the state of Minnesota, who he remembers your picture and remembers you being out there with us during, when we were fighting for his uncle. And to hear you even uplift his mom's name in that church in such a sacred place, it was so meaningful to him that like right now he's studying it in school, and he's so empowered and is so like excited to be able to share his own journey. And so we haven't really had a chance to really process it in depth together, but like he's working on like doing a recap so that he can share it back with his like classmates of like how this was such a sacred moment to be in and to be there, like to lock, like he was like right behind you walk, I was looking at some of the pictures and he and it's just crazy. But I want to say thank you because it's moments like this where I chose to go. I knew it was going to be hard, I knew there was going to be a lot of emotions, but I also was excited to be able to see some of those people who paved the way for people like me.
Well, let me ask you this, Mata. So you're a woman of faith. You mentioned your belief in Jesus. Here's the thing: so much of the movement for civil rights coming out of Selma were people who shared your faith. Uh, People who were down pressed, terrorized, abused, tortured, and mistreated because of their color of their skin, and they share your faith. So when you were in Brown Chapel, knowing that that was where Martin Luther King spoke, knowing that where their Christian faith motivated them, and as you know, I'm a person of faith. I'm a Muslim, but I'm also a person of faith, and so it was an emotional moment from a spiritual standpoint. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then also walking over the Edmund Pettus Bridge with your son and with Yusuf Jackson, with your husband, with some of your other colleagues. What was the spiritual impact on you?
I think the spiritual impact on me was just like, I think being in that church and thinking about, Yusuf's or Reverend Jesse Jackson, like his story and how organizing for him really also started there, like, and I think that was something that I learned, right? Just like being a part of this. It just really meant a lot because I think for me also, it kind of just goes back to my story of being a Southeast Asian person. You talked about like, like anti-Asian hate, all of those things are all kind of connected because even when my family came to the US, um, we were called all sorts of gooks and chinks and all of that. And
Yeah.
you talked about like the colorism, right? Like in the model minority myth, and like it was a way for people to really pin us against one another. So I wanted to just share that really quickly because I think when I think about Jesus and I think about our faith in general and the spirituality, I think one of the biggest moments for me being there was that it was a place of just love, to love your neighbors. The first thing is to, for us
Mhm.
as believers is really to love God and to love others. And like I think that's why when I met you for the first time, knowing that you're a Muslim, but me being a Christian and believer in Jesus Christ, I think it was so good because like you saw me for who I am. You didn't like look at the faith, like I think you honored and welcomed that as I did also with you, because that's what we are to do, is just to love one another. But I think what meant so much to me being there was that when I think about Dr. Martin Luther King and other believers that share the same faith as mine, is that the Black community, even in my own community, they have this like backup, if you will, like buy-in of all of these communities, whether they're believers in Jesus Christ or not. For me, it's a little different because when I came to the US, we had all these like white saviors, if you will, like the Catholic charities, like the white, like the way that we look and the way that I'm understanding and knowing now as I've become, like I'm in my late 40s, is that I only know the Jesus of the Bible who looks like me and you, really.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
but when we came to America, you saw like this blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus like picture all over, and you had all these white people from Catholic charities who came to rescue us, put us up in places, didn't come check up on us. I mean, we are products of war and genocide, and there's all this harm and pain, so there's all this unlearning that our community has to do. And so I, as a believer, and in a movement leader, never really got that support from my own people, even though they valued and believed in like people like Harriet Tubman, in people like,
Sure.
Dr. Martin Luther King. They were all believers, right? But for
Yep.
me, I didn't really have that support because of the pain that my people went through from these white saviors who called themselves Christians, that went to us when we came as refugees, but then didn't come back and check up on us or cared for us. And so it was so meaningful being in there, because I was like, this is a place that I can put the two most valuable things in my life together. Is like right now is caring for people through the movement work, but also caring for people through the lens of Jesus for who they are,
Mm,
and not
mm.
by anything that they do. Like, I don't Jesus never talked about, whether or not the woman who had to choose her own bodily autonomy, what, like, I think it's like crazy, because now I'm going to go into all these different things I probably shouldn't talk about, but it's like, it's hard being a Christian right now in this moment, especially as a Southeast Asian Christian woman. And when people don't really understand the true Jesus of the Bible, like right now, he'd be flipping tables. Like if he was here, he'd be flipping tables and he'd be pissed. And like, he, like, you know, the word of God does say that, like, when that time comes, you'll be able to separate the goat from sheep, right? And it's like, I feel like in that moment, it was just so special to me, um, because I got to be there with my husband, with my son, and it, I don't know. And then we came back and we watched the movie all over again, and I was just like, it got me really emotional, because it was just such a true, like a true honor to be able to be there and to walk along that bridge, locking hands with you guys on that bridge, and with you
It was a beautiful
especially.
moment.
It was such a beautiful moment, because it wasn't just honoring history. Like, we were really standing in it, even 61 years later, locking arms with you. Like, my life is a part of like what those movements made possible.
That's right. Right. That's right. Well, I always think to myself, whenever, I think of my Christian mother and my Christian family, I think about how they were inspired by, my brother likes to say, my brother's a Baptist minister, and he'll say, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, the poor, the poor. These people who don't care about the poor, I don't know what they're talking about, right? And he has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives. What does that mean? And recovering sight to the blind, and set at liberty those who are oppressed. Now, let me tell you, that's what I understand the Christian faith to mean. If you're on something else, I don't know what you're talking about. You know, um, I don't know where you're going with that. Because that's what it is in my understanding. But yet we got people running around saying that they believe in that, but they want to throw people out of the country. They want to take people into detention. They want to send armies of people to Minnesota, shoot down people who are standing up for their neighbors. This is what they're talking about. And so there's a break. And so, we went through Operation Metro Surge, and as you know, a lot of people in Alabama were sympathetic to what we had been facing in Minnesota. Hey, let me ask you this, if you don't mind. And Martha, I don't want to make you upset or see you, emotional, but I think that for a lot of people who are watching or listening, they really don't know what the people of Cambodia went through. I'm sure as a Minnesotan, you probably run into really well-intentioned, good people who don't know that living under the Khmer Rouge and 2 million people genocided, or maybe more than that. Would you mind just educating us a little bit, if it doesn't cause you too much emotional pain?
No, it's okay. I think it's really important to actually share it. So thank you. I was in Cambodia for the very first time. It was very bittersweet. Um, in November of 2022. Even though I've
By the way, are you born here or are you born here?
I wasn't born in either places, but that's where they would deport me to.
Right,
Just
right.
like my brother. My family escaped the genocide of the Khmer Rouge, and I was in utero. So when my parents escaped. And so there's a lot of trauma that
Yeah.
I experienced in utero that I never even, I think it was just understanding therapy and all that, as I got older, because it's also a stigma, like you don't share the pain that you experience and all of that. And so I was in utero, my parents escaped, and then I was born in a Thai refugee camp in Khao Dang. So a lot of Southeast Asian refugees, especially Cambodians, we were born in a refugee camp called Khao Dang. It doesn't exist anymore.
So wait a minute. So your mom is fleeing the Khmer Rouge, who've already killed literally millions of people, and you're inside her belly, and she's trying to flee to save your life and her life and your family. Is that real?
Yeah, yep. And so my parents, so it was in my parents were separated when they escaped, and my dad had two children and my mom had two children because they were split. Only by the grace of God they found each other in this Thai refugee camp, and where I was then born. And then my two younger brothers were conceived in the refugee camp, and then were born there, and then our families came to the United States in 1984.
May I just say, some of you all may remember a very important film called The Killing Fields.
It was made in 1984. Yeah, it was about that. You know what? It's so crazy because a lot of people don't really know, but yes, The Killing Fields, it was actually made, I think, in 1984, but I watched it very early on. And but the thing is that even though it was pretty true to the way that it, like the actual real story, the reason why Minnesota 8 continues to exist today, and to do a lot of storytelling, is because we want to be able to share the stories of what really happened to our communities from the lens of our people. And because again, they were white journalists and stuff that went out there to capture these stories, etc. And but yeah, it was gosh, millions of people. And when I went to Cambodia in November of 22, it was so bittersweet. I came to the US in 1984 as a 4-year old. Um, but my parents, I had never went to Cambodia because I had not become a citizen until, get this, because I wasn't a citizen when I met you. I didn't become a citizen until January 14th, 2020. It was 3 weeks after my mom passed away. So my parents passed away a year after each other. And I believe my dad passed away from a broken heart because of my dad was a freedom fighter for the United States during the war. And he wasn't even recognized. None of that. And so I remember my mom just being my champion, like just really proud of me, even though for a long time she told me to just keep my mouth shut. I got into trouble growing up in school because we were getting picked on so much, and just being told that just to keep my mouth shut, right? And she became really proud of me when she saw me fighting for my brother because she saw the injustice of what was happening. And so you want me to share, I'm sorry, I'm getting distracted, but like, so the people of Cambodia had to escape this genocide called the Khmer Rouge, which was, basically by Pol Pot, who was a communist, that like the Vietnam war, and the secret war in Southeast Asia, not just the Vietnam War, but the secret war in Southeast Asia. A lot of folks don't know this because it's not taught in our schools. But America, or Southeast Asia, is the most heavily bombed countries at the hand of the US. And Cambodia, because of like the Vietnam War and everything that was happening there, President Nixon actually secretly bombed Cambodia and the surrounding because they thought that we had like things, something to do with like the Vietnam folks. But what they didn't know was like that between these countries we had our own like issues like internally between these like Southeast Asian countries. And so then that paved the way for Pol Pot and the Cambodian communists, the Khmer Rouge, to then come and invade and then like basically used the Vietnam War as leverage to scare the people, right? To scare our people. And then they forced them into like all of these like hard labor working. They, if you go watch the killing fields, because it is like it's not like as accurate, but it is pretty accurate, right? It gets, and like they were killing people by just shooting them. They were wrapping them up in like bags. And when I went in November of 22, I actually went to the killing fields, and I talked about my parents passing away a year after one another. And I had never had a problem crying. I think I probably cried really hard when I met you for the first time in your office. But after my dad passed away, I haven't been able to shed a tear. I struggle with the release of it, and then I feel like I'm drowning. But when I went to Cambodia, and I went to the killing fields, like they have these different um, places that you can go and you learn about it. And I saw like all of these skulls. Um, and like it's crazy because it's like a museum of like people who were never identified. And there were thousands of skulls there, and it has like these like they're color coded by like how old they may have been. And then there was this tree, and I think that's probably where I was able to weep. And I think it had to do with me being in the motherland. It was so bittersweet because I brought both of my parents' ashes with me there. I never got to go there with my parents, but I was able to bring them with me and journeyed there with me. And there was this tree where that's and it tells you like it tells you what it is, and it was like where a lot of the young children were killed, by hanging or like being beaten up against like the tree. It was awful. And I just remember sitting there at one point, and I looked across the field, and I saw like there was like a mall that was being built, because it's like the community still has to move forward. But it's just so sad that there's like two different areas of like the killing fields is all over Cambodia. So it's like you hear stories of like all these haunted things, etc. And but it's just awful. And that's the part of the reason why like our family then escaped genocide, ended up in Thailand or the Philippines or wherever, where then finally the refugee resettlement program, like, and like they created this refugee resettlement like bill or whatever, and it's a failed resettlement program because then what happened is like they ended up bringing all of these Southeast Asian refugees over, and they placed us in all these inner cities all across the United States, like Philly, Long Beach, California, St. Paul, Minnesota, etc. And they put us in these places where like all of these homes, where these projects where a lot of black folks used to live, right? They kicked the black folks out. And then when they had this refugee resettlement, they made it look like, oh, they were doing all this good stuff for these Southeast Asian folks. But really what they were doing was they were actually hiding, the stuff that they were doing. And then that's what then kind of started the war, if you will, on like black folks seeing like, oh my gosh, they just kicked us out of this very project, but now they're putting all these Asian people in there. And so when we think about the history and the stories, a lot of folks who may not be in the movement may not actually realize the history and like why our people ended up in these places. And it wasn't because, oh, we were better than the black folks. No, it was because the US was trying to hide what they had done to our people. And then because they had just moved our folks or black folks out, they put it's easy to just house Asian folks in these very places that were condemned. Like they condemned so many of these buildings, and then they put our people in there. And these folks were so poor and experienced all this genocide that when they came here and they lived in these buildings that were awful, they thought they were, it was still a good place.
I'm hoping that people you listening to this broadcast of Affording Your Life will understand one that we do need solidarity. People of African descent, Asian, Latino, white, all of a whole human family. And you have a story that I don't think enough people know about, right? And you just shared that a little, and you did more than just give me a bunch of facts and figures because people can get on Wikipedia if they want. But what you shared is how people felt and what they were going through, and that's the real learning that we need to have.
when we think about, well, I just want to ask you this because when I went back then in 23, I did a listening tour with those who
Yeah,
have been deported and how our struggles were tied and how they ended up being in why they
right.
were deported. So I want to ask you this question. When you think about the first mass shooting during our lifetime in America, what do you think about? What's the first school shooting
Well,
that
the
comes to
first school
mind?
shooting that jumps to mind is Columbine for me.
That's the answer I
Yeah.
get from everybody. And it was so crazy for me because when I was talking to one of our deportees, he grew up in Stockton,
Mm,
California. And when you get a chance, look this up. I remember hyperventilating when he started to share this story with me because you think about our people who came to the US in the late, like the early 80s or the late 70s. There were folks that came pre-war, and then there were folks that came afterward, like my family. And he was pre-war. He had just come to the US also in 1984. And then January of 1987, there was a mass school shooting. They call it the schoolyard shooting in Stockton, California, Cleveland
wow.
Elementary School. As he was telling me this, I was just like, I had to ask him to just give me a moment so I could walk and like take some breaths because it was first and second
Wow.
graders. They were out in the schoolyard and there was this like white 30 something years old or 20 something years old, I don't really remember, but he was up on top of the roof and he shot out while they were out there during recess. And he remembers watching bodies dropping. And he remembers saying to himself, "Oh my gosh, is this the killing? Like is
Right.
this the killing
Right.
fields that my parents were just telling me about that they escaped?" And he remembers seeing his second grade teacher look at him and say, "Run!" It was like slow motion, and that's when he finally ran. And what it was actually a white person who attempted to murder like all of these Southeast Asian refugees who had just come to America because he thought there were so many of them invading
Wow.
his spaces. And but none of us ever knew about that. None of us, I didn't know about that until I was 44 years old or 43 years old when I went to Cambodia to listen to a deportee and understand his journey and how he ended up in trouble and then being deported. And that was a part of his journey because his family just escaped genocide. He comes to America a few years later. Now there's all these, so there were seven, I think there were seven deaths, but then there was 37 that were injured during this, and they were all like under 7 years old. All Southeast Asian. I think like two Cambodians, three Vietnamese or four Vietnamese, and then one was him. And he murdered or he committed suicide. But those are the things that what is so hard is that people nowadays you can still like Google things and whatever, but then it's also infiltrated with AI, so you don't know what's real and
Right.
what's not real, and which is why storytelling is so important. Um,
Well, thanks for bringing that up. For people who want to know more about that tragic incident, it was January 17th, 1989. Some fellow named Patrick Edward Purdy uh, uh, opened fire with an AK-47 on a playground, Cleveland school in Stockton, California. Within 3 minutes, he fired over 100 rounds, killing Southeast Asian refugee children, and then injuring many as well. So that see what that's kind of the thing. So based on all of the experiences that you had, you got into the Minnesota Eight and led that struggle. You know, you had allies and helpers, but in many ways, you're the face of that movement. Um, talk about that, and talk about why you thought your allies in that movement you needed to click them in with the overall civil rights movement in American society, particularly during this time of Trump and Operation Metro Surge.
yeah, I think that if we talk about scriptures, I'm
Yes,
just going to
sir.
throw a scripture out there. So Genesis 50:20 says, "Even though you intended to harm me, God intended it for good." And then it goes on to say, "For the saving of many lives." And I think it's not a scripture that people really reference a lot, kind of like John 3:16, or, Jeremiah 29:11, or Proverbs 3:5-6. But this one to me really stuck during that time because it was this major crisis that my family experienced. And then I think in hindsight now, how Minnesota 8 continues to exist today to really help a lot of these families, especially right now. So I talk about how Operation Metro Surge, it did happen. And it happened, and what people saw across the country was, like the Somali community being, targeted very, very bad because of, Trump saying, that they're garbage, things like that. And then like the Latinx community. But I think what's really important for folks to understand is that, like, Southeast Asian folks during this time also experienced a lot. Like, they were literally like they
Right.
were going to people's doors and knocking on the doors and asking if there were like Southeast Asian neighbors that lived in
Right.
the community so that they can go and violate like our 14th Amendment right and just try to like pound on their doors and then go in and take people. And so it's this dominant narrative that like deportation doesn't happen to the API community, but that's very false. And
True.
so I think when I think about the solidarity and the work, it's exactly that, is that we have to remember some of these um, we have to remember the way that white America pins us against one another, and the narrative that they try to portray, that like we're the good immigrants or whatever. Well, when it comes to deportations, they don't care who's a good immigrant versus who's a bad immigrant, right? They're just deporting everybody because these numbers matter to them. And so I think what's really important for folks to really understand is that solidarity, even solidarity within our own
Yeah.
Southeast Asian ethnicities, or solidarity within our own Latinx communities, or solidarity within our own Black communities, because there's all these different ethnicities
That's right.
within
That's
each
right.
one of them, and that we have to be able to be there to support each other when when there's a need. And so I think what I thought was really wonderful, um, in Selma, I remember you being there, and I want to share this because it kind of clicks in this question that you just asked, is that the people of Selma, so for folks who are listening, our AG is so badass. Like, he is he is such a wonderful person. If you don't haven't gotten to know him in person, I mean, like, he remembered me from then, and every time he sees me, he like he remembers me. And oftentimes like people don't know that. And so I remember in Selma when you spoke at Brown Church, but then you also spoke right before we crossed the bridge. And during that time, you just said you were, the AG for the state of Minnesota, and people like just started clapping and cheering. Like, it was crazy because we were like way far away from the stage, and we heard it and everything. And it just felt so wonderful to be a part of like this living legacy of Selma, but to be a Minnesotan. And when people of Selma applauded hearing you say like Minneapolis or Minnesota, I felt like they weren't just recognizing like Minnesota being just a place, but that they recognized
Right.
our people, right? They saw us all over the news. They saw us organizing. They saw the resistance. They saw the care that the communities like showed for one another, just like, what happened to them. And then to your question around solidarity, I think for immigrant communities, Minnesota really represents something powerful. But it does come from a place of us really understanding the solidarity within all of
Right.
our uniqueness in each one of us and our ethnicities, because that's where we can turn our pain into power. And we saw that when our neighbors
Come
were
on.
there for one another. We saw that when Hmong people came to Minnesota 8, who like started as a Cambodian organization, but they were like, oh my gosh, we know that Minnesota 8 like does deportation work. Or when like other folks were able to come and being like, hey, we don't know where to go right now, but we know you do deportation defense.
Right.
Can you help me get to who I need to go to? So I think that when we think about the inspiration that lives within all of us, it really has a lot to do with solidarity and connecting like the people of Minneapolis to the starting places of like Selma.
Well, you know what? Honestly, Monta, I think this is a great place to wrap it up. Friends, Monta Chum, one of the great leaders of the Minnesota 8, stood up, found her courage, relying on her faith, helped bring liberation to people. in Minnesota and inspiration around the country. Just know this, listeners, when you think of this mass deportation that Trump has launched, it's not just Latino people, it's not just East African, West African people, it is targeted at Asian people as well. And we all have to stand together, one for all. We have to stand together, love ye one another, and just remember that we are all God's children, and we have to stand up for each other in solidarity. So, Mata Chum, you the best, my sister, and you take care.